Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Rojansky, Director of the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. I'd like to sort of prelude to my introduction by saying, and now for something completely different. You know, I'm used to introducing events on something to do with, Russian history, culture. I'm going to assume. I think this is a pretty hip crowd. Within the four corners of Monty Python and political humor and things like that. And it's not meaning to describe us as anything other than Washington nerds, but this is an unusual sort of intersection of topics for us and an unusual approach, and I think that makes it all the more important. Of course, the underlying subject matter is very close to the core of the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center and our missions, which have to do with understanding the state of the world, including the state of a pending and I think very acute crisis we now face, and drawing lessons and insights from the way that others see problems, including, of course, Russia, but also North Korea, which we'll talk about more today as well. Before I introduce our speakers for this afternoon, just a note that Wednesday this week at 3 o'clock we have one of those events that is sort of more common for us, especially nowadays, which is about the Russian film industry with Anton Dolin at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. So please join us for that. Let me try to do justice in my introduction here to three really amazing people. Cynthia Lazaroff, who will speak, I guess, together. You guys will just sort of alternate with Bruce Allyn, is a documentary filmmaker and founder of U.S. Russia exchange initiatives and Nuclear Wake-Up Call Earth. Previously, she was director of creative affairs at Armand Hammer Productions, where she supervised development of a feature film and television projects, including Mother Russia, an 8-hour miniseries for HBO, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, a 4-hour miniseries for NBC. She co-wrote the story for The Last Russian Tsar, an NBC special narrated by Jeremy Irons, and she's been an advisor and consultant on numerous other Russian film and television projects, and has extensive experience in both film production and negotiations in Russia and the region. Bruce Allyn, who's a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project at Harvard Law School, is also former director of the Harvard Soviet Joint Study on Crisis Prevention. For 3 decades, he's taught negotiation and mediation and served as a strategic advisor and negotiation trainer to national and state governments, corporate leadership teams, and NGOs. He worked with President Mikhail Gorbachev and his government on negotiations to reduce nuclear risk and reform foreign and domestic policy in the 1980s. And I just learned today lived in Moscow from 89 to 99. That's a pretty impressive stint. And brought together top decision makers from the Cuban Missile Crisis for a series of face-to-face dialogues in 1987, 89, and 92, including in Moscow and Havana. And for those who are not aware, Bruce and Cynthia are married, so that will help as context for the presentation.
Yeah, I don't have to worry about sexual harassment necessarily.
In case you're wondering why the premise of the story is that they were at home together. And then, of course, the comment following their presentation will be provided by my boss and Senior Vice President, Director of International Security Studies here at the Wilson Center, Rob Litvak. He is also a consultant to Los Alamos National Laboratory and has served previously in the government as National Security Council Staff Director for Nonproliferation during the Clinton administration. You might recall that was when we had the first big North Korea nuclear crisis, so that was Rob's problem. Good work on that one, Rob. Solved it. He's the author of a number of books, including Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Outlier States, and most recently, appropriately, Preventing North Korea's Nuclear Breakout, Iran's Nuclear Chess, and Deterring Nuclear Terrorism. So I'm going to get out of the way now. It's fitting I'm at this end of the table. Please, Bruce and Cynthia, take it away.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. We're delighted to be here today, and we had a wonderful session. Thank you, the Wilson Center, for a session this morning with 25 senior congressional staff. And it's quite a delight for us to be here and tell our story and to share with you how we've come over the last couple of years, having both of us been deeply involved in work with Russia and risk reduction in the 80s. And then after the wall came down and the Cold War was over, we went on to other things. She was saving coral reefs, and I was working in mediation in Africa. But suddenly the problem came back. So beginning around 2014, both of us with our extensive backgrounds got re-engaged in the field and were involved in producing a film on U.S. Russian relations and the nuclear threat over the last year or two. And then this particular event happened one Saturday morning. So anyway, we'll go back and forth here.
So I just want to echo what Bruce said. We're really honored to be here today to share the story of our journey over the last few years, being reawakened to the escalating nuclear danger by most of the top experts in the U.S. and Russia, including Matt Rojansky here at the table with us, who we interviewed for this film, and also then we had our own personal wake-up call experience in Hawaii on January 13th, 2018, when we received this message on our cell phones.
So again, the context, having been out of the field for a while, in 2014, when the Russians annexed Crimea, relations went to such a low point that we re-engaged, and those of us at the Harvard Negotiation Project who've used successfully in the past certain kinds of innovative negotiation approaches to help break deadlock were called back in to work with different U.S. Russian track 2 diplomacy groups. So we were called in to work on easy issues like election meddling and some others, and the nuclear deadlock. So in that context, we were working on that and at the same time producing a film.
So we interviewed over 60 experts and individuals in the U.S. and Russia on the escalating nuclear danger and on the state of U.S.-Russian relations. And I have to say that every person we interviewed taught us something very profound, and every person we interviewed brought up the escalating nuclear danger between the two countries. It was something that came, we knew relations were deteriorating, we were concerned about that, both of us with our backgrounds, but we had no idea that, as many of the experts told us, that not only are we at a danger that is as great as it was during the Cold War, but perhaps an even greater danger than even the peak crisis moments of the Cold War. This was a huge awakening for me.
And again, I think most people nowadays would agree that it's a level of nuclear danger that's perhaps greater than or at least equal to the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Now, this is not understood, and the public is blissfully unaware of this. There are a range of factors behind this which we want to bring out to you.
So I would say that, again, everyone really taught us something, but I would say the two people who really had the most profound impact on us were former Secretary of Defense William Perry and Mikhail Gorbachev. We interviewed Secretary Perry in November of 2017, and he told us that he's terrified. And when someone at that level, with that degree of experience and knowledge about the nuclear issue says that, it was a profound, again, a wake-up call for us. So I'm just going to take a minute and play an excerpt from this forthcoming film so you can hear what he has to say in his own words.
Because we don't understand the dangers, we make no attempt, no serious attempt to repair the hostility between the United States and Russia. And so we are allowing ourselves to sleepwalk into another catastrophe. We must wake up.
So that notion of needing to wake up is something that is a theme that Bill Perry at 90 now today, this is his mission in life, to make the world safer and preventing a nuclear war. He has 11 grandchildren. This is what he's doing every day now at this age, is working to reduce the nuclear threat. Very inspiring.
Yeah.
So then we interviewed Mikhail Gorbachev in December of 2017, and he says that we're in a new nuclear arms race. And again, just a quick clip so you can hear what he has to say.
Если соревнование начнется на этом направлении, мы погубим всех и планету погубим.
So again, if we allow our rivalry to continue in this direction, we will destroy everyone and the whole planet. Those are the words that he left us with in December of 2017. These are some of the other issues that Bruce is going to talk about, just to give you headlines as to why people are saying that we're at a greater danger. People who really know, people who backed us away from the brink before than we were during the Cold War.
And this is also part of our story as we approached January 2018, where we ourselves got a rather gut-wrenching nuclear wake-up call. We had been, we just spent time with Gorbachev, with Bill Perry, with Bob Legvold here, who makes a critical point. We're now in a world where there are not just 2 nuclear powers. We have many Dr. Strangeloves. We have 9 nuclear powers. We have a multipolar nuclear world slowly spinning out of control. And the U.S. and Russia have over 90% of the nuclear weapons. So obviously, if we can't get our act together, the probability of doing something globally to reduce the danger is minimal, if not non-existent. Also, and we are seeing it now more than ever with INF and risks of New START, the breakdown of arms control, no rules of the road for absolutely terrifying new weapon systems, that conventional systems that interact with nuclear systems, and we now have challenges to strategic stability, a question that used to be fairly easy in a bilateral context, where the Soviet Union and the United States had to make sure that if they got attacked, they had enough weapons to inflict unacceptable damage in a second strike to the other side. That was strategic stability. Now it's a much more complicated world with interactions of conventional weapons and other factors in the equation.
And the introduction of autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, the increasing role that cyber is playing in weapons systems, all of these things are new, and unlike what we had traditionally with arms control, where we did have rules of the road that were followed for decades, there are no rules of the road for this new technology. There's no conversation about it, and the experts say we're really in a Wild West for these new weapon systems that are exceedingly dangerous.
And the new nuclear policy advisor in the Joint Staff in the Pentagon underlines the issues with command and control. Eric Schlosser and others have underlined this, but though the risk of hacking is low, it's catastrophic. The consequences are potentially catastrophic, and if you know the facts, it's unnerving to say the least.
And we did hear in one of the sessions in 2017 from a senior Russian weapons expert that ISIS has been recruiting IT specialists in Russia, and that some have gone missing. And so that was also another moment of a wake-up call for me, devastating information, just even if it is low probability, the thought that there are people potentially controlled by ISIS who are experts who are working on hacking into command and control. That was terrifying for me personally.
So, and the problem we have is that in the 70s and 80s, was starting with Kissinger's détente, when Kissinger said, we have a hierarchy of national interests. The first one is avoiding the great evil of nuclear war. He put that higher than containing Soviet expansion. Now we have problems where, because of events in the annexation of Crimea and Russian activity in Ukraine, essentially we cut off a lot of cooperation and communication. And the great evil of the threat of nuclear war has receded into the background. And there are many reasons, we can go into this in great depth, why, denial, we thought we handled that, it's too terrifying to think about, we've got climate change now, we have too many things to worry about. The new generation didn't grow up with duck and cover and didn't grow up with the fear that we in the 80s had when we watched the film The Day After, for those of you who remember. So there's many challenges to bringing this risk to the fore and into political consciousness publicly and in the government without paralyzing people. And the same problem is in Russia. They use the term, the непуганное поколение, for the younger generation in Russia, that's the unscared, unfrightened generation. The challenges of bringing this to the fore. So it seems as if we don't have to worry about it, we can pursue other interests. And so, because of our deep political differences and very serious problems, you know, with Russia these days, we've held hostage the cooperation in the nuclear field to our political differences. And we have to have conversations on strategic stability and other things that have just been suspended. And in a sense, as we'll develop, we have to decriminalize talking with Russia on nuclear cooperation.
Unlike during the Cold War, where there was always a safe space, an insulated space for talks on nuclear risk reduction and arms control, those have largely gone away. And so that is another factor why we are at a greater risk today, because at least back then, no matter what was going on, we were talking to each other about nuclear risk reduction, and we had better contacts than we do today. And so that exacerbates the tensions, and that increases the likelihood of a blundering into a war due to miscalculation or accident or lack of communication in such a situation.
So, and again, you know, the absence of a normal dialogue like we had for decades, even after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we boycotted the Olympics in 1980. Nonetheless, we were talking about nuclear issues. And that's a lesson from the past that we really need to relearn today. So it's made by many people. Most recently, you know, we had an editorial in the Wall Street Journal last week from George Shultz, from William Perry, from Sam Nunn about the need for a bold initiative to re-engage Russia on nuclear issues. There are, you know, Jerry Brown. There's a whole range of people who've taken a somewhat risky stance in this current climate where talking with Russia has been rather toxic. Certainly on the Russian side, there are many who are trying to make connections, not all just propagandists, serious people in the Russian parliament and Senate. There was, in past times, a very productive bipartisan group that held communication with the Russians on nuclear issues in our own Congress. And that's their initiatives now to bring that back today.
So these are all people that we've been interviewing for this documentary, and you know, again, this idea that we could have World War III by mistake is prevalent at this time among the expert and U.S. Russian relations community and the nuclear security community. So again, the last interview we did before the events in January was with Gorbachev, and one of the last things he said to us was the nuclear threat is again real. Our relations have been going from bad to worse. We must break out of this situation. We won't survive if someone loses their nerves in this current tension. So we came home to, in Hawaii, the height of the fire and fury. This was that moment when the risk of nuclear confrontation with North Korea appeared to be escalating, and in the state of Hawaii, we were receiving all kinds of alerts and things from the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency about what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. There were tensions in Hawaii at this time because we knew we had been identified on the map of death as part of the target of North Korea. So it was in this context, and my personal context, having spent 7 years developing a project for Showtime, writing the story on Hiroshima, I was also personally very familiar with the stories of people who had survived Hiroshima and what it was like. And so the effects of radiation and fallout were very present in my own personal history on that morning in January. So this is where we live. This is where we came home after interviewing Gorbachev. This is where we were that morning on January 13th. We live on the eastern shore of Kauai, which is one of the smallest of the inhabited islands. We have 73,000 people. We live on a 5-acre farm. And
so we've come back where our sense of the danger is heightened, and we watch our Friday night movie together. And what do we watch? We watch Eric Schlosser's Command and Control, you know, which tells the story of horrifying nuclear accidents, including the Titan missile explosion in 1980 and others. So that's our Friday night movie, okay, on this particular January 12th evening.
So we go to bed with that on our mind. And
we wake up, and this sunrise is absolutely gorgeous. I run out, I take pictures, I send it to all our family and friends. It's a gorgeous blood red sunrise.
Very unusual. Even though we have beautiful sunrises, this one was extremely unusual, and so Bruce was inspired to photograph it, as he said. And then a little bit later, at 8:07 a.m., we got this message, this alert. We were two of over 1 million people across the Hawaiian Islands that got this message at 8:07 in the morning. It lit up our cell phones. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill.
So initially, I said, this is a hoax. This can't be happening, you know. And then I, of course, tried to dial 911. It's totally busy. It wasn't on my phone, but it popped up because AT&T got it later than Verizon. You know, there were these moments that I'll never forget. So I still didn't totally believe it was real. But at that point, you know, 2 younger daughters are 7 miles away. Other daughters in Los Angeles. That's what you think of the first moment. Where are your loved ones?
So we're going to talk more about our family's experience in a moment. We want to show you what happened to some other people in Hawaii, just to give you a feel for it. This is a short clip from a film that we've been asked to participate in called This Is Not a Drill by Juris Productions. Rob and Keiko Feldman are making this, and we just want to show you what it was like in real time for some people that morning. It will take you there with us before we tell our story. Let's see.
It says this is not a drill.
Missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill.
But I don't even know where we go.
I don't know where the f to go right now. I mean, we're sitting ducks here.
We had the coach say, "Get out of the water."
I just heard him yell, "Get in the tub. Get in the tub. Go, we need to go right now."
I mean, this literally could be the start of a nuclear war.
There's a missile coming, there's a missile coming.
That was when I panicked.
I need to know if the ballistic missile threat is real.
Our hotel is on the alert.
Is there a missile coming towards Hawaii?
Okay.
Is a missile coming?
I'm getting messages about incoming missiles.
It is unclear what has sparked the warning, but residents have been told to seek immediate shelter.
Oh my God! What do we do?
Where do we go? We're completely unprepared.
There were people who put their children in manholes.
We have no designated nuclear shelters in Hawaii. So people, it was really chaos, panic, confusion, people running through the streets of Honolulu, people driving at 90, 100 miles an hour. And so we just want to take a moment to tell you what it was like for our family, what it was like to feel for 38 minutes, which is how long it took for us to get the message on our cell phones that it wasn't real, what it's like to feel like you're about to be hit by a nuclear missile, what it was like for us with all that we had going on in our consciousness. The first, as Bruce mentioned, is it real? That was really what we know was the collective shared experience of people across Hawaii. And so everybody was dialing 911. That's what Bruce tried to do initially. So it was jammed. Nobody could get through to 911. So I thought of who do I know who's going to know? Who's the most well-connected person that I know? And I called a journalist, a friend named Felicia Cowden, who has access to all the county officials, and it was very hard to get through to her. It took a long time. I wasn't able to get through to her. I left her a message. I checked her Facebook page. There was no information there. I used every way I could to get through to her, but there was nothing at a point where Bruce said, I don't know if this is real or not, but I got to go get the girls. Our 2 younger daughters, as he mentioned, were 7 miles away. And I said, well, wait a second. If it's real, I don't want to be separated. I mean, we need a place where we're going to meet. And I really wasn't thinking about where that was going to be. He just said, call me in the car, we'll figure it out, because we had to get to the girls. So Bruce, tell what it was like on the highway.
So you can imagine we have a 2-lane highway going around the island. And I get out on the highway, and I myself am driving 90 miles an hour. There were other people driving at that speed, and then there were the ones who didn't get the alert. So they're slowing down, waving their fists out at the crazy speeders, and immediately there's all kinds of, there were traffic accidents, there was, confusion, and in the town, people are crossing the meridians, they're running into CVS and laying down in the food aisle, kind of claiming space.
Beside strangers.
Beside strangers, and we didn't know it was real until we got the word from the county. And that's what I think is very important. I could have disbelieved something on my cell phone, but when we heard that the county officials, because you cannot believe that that level of fallibility could happen, right? That government officials, not only did it take them 38 minutes to cancel it, but that, other government officials and serious people believed the alert was real for a long time.
So again, the experience of where are my children, where are my loved ones, that was an immediate for everybody in the state. And then what do I do, where do I go? And so once I got through to Felicia, I heard from her that the county officials are telling us to take shelter. That was when I kicked in of, okay, I really have to take this seriously. And so I chronicle this in the article that's been referenced moment by moment, what you do when you think, okay, well, if this is it, what do I need to take with me? And I did not follow the guidelines of the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. I did not want to accept that we were in a time where we could actually, even with my expertise, have to prepare for a nuclear war. We also live in Hawaii, as you know, and there's no real way to seal our home. You can't really seal a Hawaiian home. You need to have air. It's a hot place. So it all seemed ridiculous to me. But in that moment, I thought, oh my God, I haven't prepared my family. I haven't stocked the water. I did that in California for earthquakes, but I haven't done it here. And so I, went around the house looking for, I had a couple of bottles of water, I had a bunch of bananas, I had a few things to throw into a bag, and then, what could I cover myself, what could, how could I protect my family in the short time that I had, and then where to go. And it was only in a conversation with a friend whose cell phone was turned off, a very dear friend that I called to say, do you know, that he reminded me that we have a cave, a meditation cave right in our area that we know well. And it's actually because of the state that I was in, even though I'd had this conversation some months before with the journalist about where we would go, I didn't really think about it until the question was asked, where do we go? And I said, someplace sealed, the cave. Oh, right. So in those preparations for the cave, I took whatever I could, my passport. I looked at my phone. It had 12% charge. That was my contact to the outside world. So I thought, I'll take my charger. Are there lights in this cave? I remember there's some, maybe I can get some electricity there. I remembered there were some lights there. My computer, my passport, my purse, all the cash I had, I just threw it all in the bag.
And she wanted to set the alarm system on the house before leaving.
Because I was not quite in that world yet of really believing that I was in the world that I was in. And I think that it was on the way to the cave where I also had to let Bruce know where we were going, communicate where to meet, that I really began to experience the emotion of what was going on. And up to that point, I didn't allow myself to feel anything because I wouldn't have been able to hold it together to actually get anywhere safe if I needed to be safe, and to make the decisions and to be rational in my preparations and to do the best I could to get us there and have my family there, our family there safe. So the other thing that I didn't allow myself to do, not knowing how many minutes there were and how much time we had, was to call my daughter in LA. And I didn't think about it until I was on my way to the cave, but I knew that was the moment. It just came into my awareness that that was it. And that's the moment that this experience became the most real to me. It was hard to get through to her. My cell phone doesn't work well where we live. And so it was only at the floor to the steps to the cave, up the hillside, that she answered. And I said, Mackenzie, I don't know if you've been listening to the news, and we don't know if it's real or not, but we've all just got a message on our cell phones that we're going to be hit by a ballistic missile. I just want to tell you that I love you, and I'll call you again from the cave if I can. And there was silence, and then she said, I love you too, Mom. And then silence again, and then I didn't really want to hang up and let her go. And in that moment, it was when it was not just about my life and my daughter's life and our family's life and Hawaii's life, but we didn't know if this was the beginning of this happening in other places in the world. We didn't know if this was an isolated event. It was really taking in the possibility that this was the beginning of the end of life as we know it, the beginning of a civilization and ending event. And that was, that has stayed with me. And so in that moment of silence where all of this was coming to me, she said, "Mom, go, go." And so I walked to the top of the steps to the cave, and then as I was about to open the door of the cave, my neighbor walked out smiling with a water bottle in her hand and said, "It's a false alarm." But that was 38 minutes before we found out that it was a false alarm. And so that's sort of our personal story.
And it's kind of, an extraordinary thing psychologically to go through this and realize that at the moment when everyone is completely transfixed with fear, the human thing you do is you call or go to the people you love and say, "I love you." So strangely, in Hawaii, this moment of greatest fear, there were calls streaming out all over the world saying, "I love you." And it's at a human dimension, that's quite extraordinary. That it often takes something to remind us what is most precious in life, right? We go on in our everyday, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps on in its petty pace. We think it's going to keep, and when you face a near-death situation, it wakes you up to what is most precious. And we know as human beings that's hard to keep that consciousness. The Dalai Lama and others keep calling on us to realize how precious life is every moment, but we human beings easily lose that consciousness. There's a great proverb in Russian, which is "Pakogromny granit muzhik ni perekrestitsa," which is until the thunder roars, until your life is at stake, the person doesn't, cross oneself. You don't think of higher purpose or meaning until the thunder is roaring, right? So this was a roar of thunder for us on this morning in January. And I have to credit Cynthia because, what's next? What do we have for next year? When it was over, I thought, thank God it's over. I'm going to the farmer's market to see if there's any cinnamon rolls left, right? That was my consciousness. And she's going, "This is a gift, this is a lesson, this is a wake-up call. We've got to write about this, turn on the news," whatever. She was so fired up, right? And so for days she was writing every detail and ended up writing this wonderful article in the Bulletin, right? And I realized it really was a wake-up call. 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis wake-up call. Ronald Reagan had a wake-up call when he watched the film the day after. It's in his diary. He says, "I was completely depressed and moved by this film." And it shifted him toward his engagement with Gorbachev. Gorbachev had several wake-up calls in the early 80s when there were some false alerts, in 1983 that almost ended the world. There's a film out called "The Man Who Saved the World." A Russian missile officer didn't send the warning on up higher about a massive attack when everything he had in front of him said it was real, but he didn't do it. So
let's say his name, Stanislav
Petrov, yeah. And Gorbachev's big wake-up call was Chernobyl. People don't realize this, but anyway, so this was a wake-up call for us, and I have to credit her for seeing the value in taking the word out.
I just felt that we had to, it was a moment of just coming home to the farm. It was just, we're still here. It was like we were given our life back because we had faced the possibility of the extinction possibly of all life on Earth. And so I felt a responsibility to share this experience so that others could know what it's like to have this awakening.
So what are the lessons? We'll be brief here because we need to wrap up. But the lessons, the obvious ones are, well, how come the guy that pressed the wrong button didn't have another button right there to say, "Sorry, false alert"? There wasn't one, right? There now is one, okay? Now it takes two people to press that button instead of one. The poor guy that pressed the button, I really feel for him. He's been vilified and fired and everything else. There's a whole story around why he pressed it and what were the breakdowns in the overall system, and but he took responsibility for it. The Hawaiian senators and congresspeople have introduced legislation, Tulsi Gabbard, Brian Schatz, others, and some of it's been passed, but that's not really the issue.
For us, these kinds of measures are essential, but they're not dealing with the core issue, which is that waking up to the nuclear threat again. like we were awake in the 1980s. And so that has become the focus of our work since this experience. It was really a culmination of all that we'd done that previous year, waking up
And make
to
it
the
a visceral
danger.
reality. And Bill Perry, a great man, in our view, we've spent a lot of time with him, and he is relentlessly on this crusade to let people understand, you don't want to think about it, but we must. And so we've been looking for ways to share this experience without leaving people paralyzed and in despair. So Cynthia wrote the article, which was on the front page in Russian and in Russia for days and has been around the world. Also, she's done a podcast with Bill Perry and Schlosser and Scott Sagan, another get the word out that way.
On nuclear false alarms, because this one is now part of the historical record of nuclear false alarms.
Yeah, and a really interesting and innovative virtual reality experience. At a lab in Princeton, the Nuclear Futures Lab is doing an immersion where you go in and have a full VR experience of what it's like to be in, and they're using the Hawaii alert as the context.
And our family, so we're participating in that. And then again, this is the film that we showed a clip from. We're participating in documentary films that are being made about the alert. And we're doing nuclear alert simulations where we actually take people in Moscow or other places in the world through the experience of getting the message on their cell phone and what it's like to go through the experience. So just for a moment, we just wanted to, if you got this message on your cell phone, for you to take a moment. We're not going to do the simulation, but what you might feel.
Imagine it's a Saturday morning, you're in wherever you are in
January.
Washington, D.C., and it says, threat inbound to Washington, D.C.
And you find out that you hear from a really trusted, reliable government source that you believe that it's real. What is that like for you? That's what we do in the simulation in a much longer period.
So I think we'll pass the baton over to Rob at this point, but we'll simply mention that on our website, nuclearwakeupcall.earth, there are a series of critical steps. And we've done our best. As a mediator, I've sought to try to take legislative initiatives, the 5 steps that this peace group has, the 7 steps that the other one has. Lots of people are trying to do good work, but we've tried to bring together in a way that is packaged that will allow people to unify around a program. And these are big steps.
Originally inspired by the horsemen of the nuclear apocalypse.
Yeah, Kissinger, Schultz, Perry, and Nunn. So you're aware of many of the initiatives out there right now. In this list, there are things that seem to be simple, like no first use. We won't be the first ones to use nuclear weapons. President Obama tried to get this through, but it didn't go for all kinds of complicated reasons. Taking nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. It seems like the Chinese do it. They have the warheads separate from the missiles. It takes off the time crunch. When if there's a false alert, a president has 8 minutes to make a decision. There are things that we can do that are feasible. George W. Bush, a Republican, supported this measure.
So
it's
a
not
lot of
just
these
a Democratic
have
thing.
been supported by bipartisan leaders in the expert community and former officials in both parties.
So anyway, we will not. They're on our website. We can go over later, but we can come back in the comment period. We work on citizen diplomacy. We're doing mediation trainings. You may recognize Bill Urey as the second from the right there, who is a master negotiator, participates with us in giving courses in Russia and the United States and Europe. And we bring musicians over, an extraordinary Hawaii musician, Makana, played music in the Diplomatic Academy of the Foreign Ministry, first time that ever happened.
While
And
talking about nuclear security.
so we'll end on this article, which was in the last week, and move on. And thank you. And Rob, please. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to wrap up that, just a few days ago, as was mentioned, there was this article in the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, authored by George Shultz, William Perry, and Sam Nunn, which basically is calling for a bold policy shift that we must re-engage with Russia to back ourselves away from this precipice. We have to remember that the nuclear threat is still with us. So we'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matt, for organizing today's session. It's a particular pleasure to be with Bruce and Cynthia, whose work I've long admired. And you just had this sort of dramatic episode. I'm surprised that that you're making headway on the policy front, and that the reaction wasn't that of General Turgeson and Dr. Strangelove when told that we just launched a 5,000 megaton attack on the Soviet Union. He replied, "Well, I wouldn't knock the whole program because of one slip-up." And there are a lot of practical suggestions and a host of people, of scholars and policy analysts working on this, like the de-alerting proposal. I know Bruce Blair has been, who was a launch officer on an ICBM complex and has written about that at Brookings and now at Princeton. So there are a lot of practical ideas, and one hope we can get some traction on it. When there's a host or a spectrum of nuclear issues that have been addressed in this presentation that are on part of our agenda, and I think to provide what my old Russian language tutor used to call kontekst, I think of it, kind of in a framework in three categories. You've got kind of vertical proliferation, which is the increase in the arsenal size or the improvement in the capabilities among the nuclear weapon states. And one of the issues that was alluded to, how cyber and new technologies, the use of conventional platforms in strategic modes kind of are blurring some categories, and there's a modernization process going on that raise really fundamental issues of strategic stability in a context where U.S. Russia relations are bad. And Matt's on the forefront of trying to maintain dialogue, and I think that the impediments to dialogue are greater now than they were even in the 1980s when I first kind of joined the Wilson Center. Then there's vertical proliferation, which is an increase in the number of nuclear weapon states. North Korea is number 9. There were projections. It's not all bad news. There were projections, President Kennedy's nightmare scenario of 1962, world of 20 nuclear weapon states. Rand Corporation did analytical studies that there'd be many, many nuclear weapon states, all these dyads sort of deterring each other. We don't live in that world, fortunately, because most countries don't think they need nuclear weapons as an answer to their existential kind of national security dilemmas. Secondly, extended deterrence takes some states off the hook. They feel they can rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. They don't need to develop autonomous capabilities. And third, there's sort of a normative dimension through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty against acquisition of nuclear weapons. The third tranche is nuclear terrorism, and that would be a non-state actor acquiring either a weapon or nuclear weapons-usable materials. Al-Qaeda does not yet have its own uranium enrichment program, or ISIS, so they would require, these technologies are largely in the domain of states, so you would need either through leakage, that is inadequately secured materials or weapons falling into the wrong hands, or through the transfer. That's the other pathway of nuclear weapons acquisition by a non-state group. And former Secretary of Defense Gates had said that North Korea would sell anything to anyone, and that's why establishing a strong deterrent line for transfer with North Korea was important, and there's declaratory policy going back to the George W. Bush administration. So that's the framework. My work is focused on horizontal proliferation with North Korea's number 9. And when I entered this field in the 1980s, and we were talking about this over lunch, I could not have imagined that the scenario, which was the starting point of today's talk, could have happened. That you'd have North Korea with a ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon on top of it. And that's really been the starting point of our current crisis with North Korea. North Korea has been a nuclear weapon state since 2006. There's a tortured history of how it got to that point in 2006. But it's really only until 2017 that North Korea started to cross this other, dare I use the word red line, of being able to target the U.S. homeland, which President Trump, in his preferred medium, Twitter, said it won't happen. Now, this nuclear breakout is quantitative. There are projections from CSEC at Stanford and Rand Corporation, Johns Hopkins, to project that by 2020, North Korea could have as many, at the high end, 100 nuclear weapons. And to use the technical social science terminology of one of the lab directors, national lab directors, that's a hell of a lot of nuclear weapons. The Unification Ministry in South Korea said the other day that they put the number at 60 warheads. Now, these are all projections based on weapons usable, access to weapons usable material, whether it's separated plutonium or enriched uranium. So it's projections of how many warheads that they could produce. But the upper end is 100, which is a little less than half the size of the British nuclear arsenal. Put a pin in that point in a second. And then secondly, in addition, the nuclear breakout is qualitative, that North Korea has demonstrated kind of a long-range ballistic missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, multi-stage. It has, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency, as reported by the Washington Post, mastered miniaturization of warheads. The technology they have not yet demonstrated is the reentry and the accuracy of their warheads. That last step, there's contention in the analytical outside government and as well as inside on whether or not North Korea has mastered that. They've not demonstrated it. It's a complex, integrated set of technologies. It took the United States a long time to acquire it in the early 60s. Russia, China did testing to sort of demonstrate this technology. North Korea has not put the whole package together that way. You can imagine if North Korea tested a missile and there was an atomic explosion somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, just sort of to demonstrate it. I mean, which some speculated that North Korea might do back in 2016, 2017. Thankfully, they've not. But the new factor in all of this is U.S. vulnerability, that the U.S. homeland is becoming reachable, targetable by North Korea, making it the third adversarial state with Russia and China that can target the U.S. homeland. There are other states that have that capability, but are not of Israel, Pakistan, India. There are other nuclear weapon states. China and Russia are the two that have been kind of Cold War adversaries that have had this capability. North Korea joins that group. And contrast the size of the North Korean arsenal, this arsenal approaching half the size of Great Britain's, with the North Korean economy and state. It's a failed state with nuclear weapons. The CIA estimates the GDP at $40 billion. It's hard to calculate GDP in North Korea because of the character of their economy. It's autarkic. They use barter, a lot of illicit trading, in methamphetamine and counterfeit bills, et cetera, but about $40 billion is a CIA estimate. It's about the size of Dayton, Ohio, if you go to Wikipedia and look at like economic activity. So imagine Dayton, Ohio with a nuclear arsenal half the size of Great Britain's. The caloric intake, estimated 1,500 calories a day. 5-year-olds in North Korea are about 10 centimeters shorter than their South Korean counterparts. So there's a sort of a grotesque kind of eugenics experiment being conducted by the North Korean regime against its own people, where one society is getting 1,500 calories a day, another's getting 2,500, 3,000 calories. And in North Korea, you have essentially a dynastic cult, the Kim family, complete with, Kim Jong-il plays golf for the first time, has 10 holes in one or something like that. I mean, it's insane, the cult. And the dilemma that arises from that you have two timelines, the nuclear timeline, which is urgent and immediate, and the prospects for regime evolution or regime transformation in North Korea, which is indeterminate. Everyone's been expecting them to collapse since the 1990s when they had a famine. But in a perverse way, the regime is like hyper-stable. They're hanging in there with pressures that would have collapsed most regimes. This link between capabilities and regime character is something I've written about in my work on rogue states, because the term rogue state connotes essentially a crazy state. And in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, we had Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya as the core group of rogue states. And there was this connotation that these states are, by their very nature, kind of undeterrable, essentially crazy states, that the threat derives from the character of the regimes, because if you turn off the bad behavior, the character of the regime is such as that the threat is still there. So that fed into the whole kind of regime change line in the early 2000s, particularly after 9/11, and was central to the argument to go for a preventive war in Iraq. In 2017, you had a escalation. It was rhetorical, as mentioned. I mean, the North Koreans sent a lot of Americans to their dictionary when they called President Trump a dotard. He came back with Little Rocket Man. The North Korean Foreign Ministry, I thought was rather, kind of inspired actually, came back with their own Elton John title, called him Madman Across the Water. But in addition, there was this rhetorical escalation. You also had nuclear weapons tests, 2 nuclear weapons tests, and 23 missile tests. So, what had been in North Korea kind of an incremental and determined program, really was looking like a crash program to develop the capability to strike the U.S. homeland, kind of a Manhattan Project. The summit meetings, there have been 2, Singapore in June 2018, Hanoi at the end of February this year. They've broken the psychology of the crisis in the sense that Trump meeting with Kim, which was a huge PR win for him back home, also kind of in a way made North Korea kind of a more ordinary state. That North Korea, Kim Jong-un meeting with Trump, he sort of was able to shed the rogue kind of rubric and perception of North Korea. And Trump, characteristically, he's kind of overshot, saying that they fell in love and this type of excessive kind of rhetoric. But the optic of North Korea as a rogue state, I think, that optic has changed through the summitry, and I think that changed the psychology of the crisis, because in 2017, with Fire and Fury, there had been this sense that the United States might attack North Korean capabilities. There was discussion about a bloody nose strike on North Korea. I mean, and with all the inherent kind of escalatory potential of that, since Seoul is as close to the DMZ as Baltimore is to Washington, North Koreans have forward deployed artillery, posing the functional equivalent of a nuclear weapon at South Korea's capital, even without the nuclear weapons and the other unconventional capabilities that they have. So it was fraught with escalatory dangers in 2017. The summits have shifted this psychology, but the approach is, and this is really kind of the point my last point I'd like just to develop for a minute, is Trump went in and with both North Korea and Iran, and I'll swing back to that point. He's pursued a transformational objective with North Korea, which is CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament now. And when North Korea, when presented with a paper in Hanoi, didn't go for it, where CVID would come before sanctions relief, the summit reached an impasse, and the two parties kind of went back to their capitals. For North Korea, nuclear weapons, and there's been literature on North Korean motivations. It's a bargaining chip. It's the one asset they have they can monetize, and they try to do it over and over again. It's also a deterrent against kind of an attack on a regime which feels besieged. After the U.S. Takedowns of regimes in Iraq and Libya, 0 warheads is not on the table with North Korea right now. And this type of transformational approach, going for kind of CVID early on and to front load the process with that. Some refer to that as the Libya model, a reference to what happened in 2003 when Libya agreed to verifiable disarmament, only in 2011 to see the regime taken down by a NATO intervention. But that was done under a humanitarian intervention rubric, not under a proliferation rubric. And we could have another seminar just on the difference between proliferation, counterproliferation, and humanitarian regime takedowns at the Wilson Center. But that's an analytical distinction without a difference if you're sitting in Pyongyang now. So after these regime takedowns, they're not going to give up, they're not going to zero anytime soon, particularly since they can monetize it over and over again. And that dynamic, the structure of this negotiation has led to a number of proposals for different types of freeze, basically trying to freeze proposals to constrain Iran and North Korea's nuclear capabilities so that a bad situation doesn't get worse, that the current number of 60 doesn't get to 100 by 2020 or 2021. And there have been a number of proposals, Sig Hecker at Stanford. There are a number of analysts. I've written about this in my publication, Preventing North Korea's Nuclear Breakout, lay out kind of what, there's a great study just out at Carnegie by Elie Levite on what a freeze would be, a kind of a structured, essentially an arms control approach that would lead toward a reduced stockpile. But the nuts and bolts of it would be kind of maintaining the moratorium on nuclear weapons testing and ballistic missile testing. And this is important so that North Korea cannot demonstrate its ability to hit the U.S. homeland with a nuclear weapon. They've got the missile and the miniaturization. They've not demonstrated the accuracy and reentry capability. So the moratorium on testing helps. That they've not demonstrated, it creates a window for diplomacy through a freeze to constrain their capabilities. Getting a declaration of facilities from North Korea, where are they producing weapons usable material? And then the North Koreans have been balking at this, as they do, providing information because they feel that they're just providing a target set to the United States. Understand that. But the goal would be to freeze production on the production of weapons usable material, both plutonium at the Yongbyon facility and enriched uranium at both at Yongbyon and at other sites which are known to exist but have not been declared. Again, the goal is to make a bad situation getting worse. Now, this would be a transactional approach to managing the North Korean problem, not a transformational approach. And ironically, and in a town that doesn't do irony very well, I'll end on that note. The precedent for this was the Iran nuclear deal, where Iran's nuclear capabilities were constrained through transactional diplomacy, which was not transformational. And that's been the nub of the criticism against the JCPOA, that it didn't include Hezbollah in Syria and Yemen and human rights in Iran, and the reasons why they went for a transactional approach. But that approach, that template, is potentially applicable to North Korea and should be revived and maintained vis-a-vis Iran. But the irony is that that type of approach has been kind of denigrated by the current administration. So let me, as the English would say, put a full stop there, and over to you, or the chairman, for...
Thank you to all three of you. I'm cognizant that there are, while in some ways the two presentations are complementary, obviously the putative missile threat would have been from North Korea. The question of what North Korea's capabilities are and whether we pursue and what kind of approach we pursue to constraining those capabilities, or maybe ultimately simply deterring them and living with them, is an enormously relevant question. But I noted a divergence, which is Cynthia and Bruce, your thinking more or less immediately went certainly in the direction of what Rob has described as transformative, but also to the, only indirectly related problem of the U.S. Russian nuclear standoff situation, which is increasingly poorly constrained by our modern surviving arms control frameworks. Whereas Rob, definitely you spoke in the realm of the transactional about countering what we still seem to be thinking of in terms of a proliferation challenge. So the question I have, and I don't know if this lines up perfectly with transactional versus transformational. I actually don't think it does. The question I have is essentially about accepting the reality of vulnerability. Because it seems to me that somehow or other, whatever cluster of motivations and politics made Cold War arms control between Moscow and Washington possible was in essence linked to a reality of vulnerability. The idea that, look, whatever we do, there really isn't a realistic path forward where we get the Soviets to give up their arsenal. There isn't a realistic path forward where we defend ourselves completely against the possible threat. So we live in a world of vulnerability, and thus, I guess, whether we're transactional or transformational, or maybe it is the abandonment of transformation. The question I'd put to all of you, maybe for a quick comment, and then we just go ahead and open the floor, is, do you think that we are living in an era of real vulnerability that goes beyond what our policy sense of vulnerability or our policy conventions of vulnerability actually acknowledge?
I could pick up on that one. When we were working in the early 80s in Soviet-Russian relations, we often used the analogy of mountain climbers who are roped together. So if one falls, you both fall, right? And certainly with MAD, mutual assured destruction, that was the case. Now, the experience of vulnerability was one that you just had to accept because, as you say, we couldn't remove the Soviet nuclear arsenal. I think that's the case now with North Korea. The idea that currently with the experience of Libya, particularly that the Koreans have been underlining, saying we learned the lesson from Muammar Gaddafi, you don't give up your nuclear weapons program because look what happens to you, right? So I think now we are fated to live with vulnerability and at least a small nuclear arsenal. And I agree with Rob's approach about a transactional goal for the current Korean situation. That's the best we could get, I think, at this point. So in a world where hostilities are lowered by deepening relations, so Cynthia and I and many others work on the human connection as well as the arms reductions and limitations, then that vulnerability isn't as scary. We're vulnerable to the United Kingdom, right? We don't worry about that British Trident sub out there and the fact that, potentially we could be hit by a British nuclear weapon, right? Because the hostility level has lowered. So I think that we follow the two tracks. We have to find intelligent ways to reduce the numbers of weapons, and certainly Cynthia and I are big supporters of Bruce Blair and Global Zero, which has an alternate nuclear posture to try to bring down the numbers to hundreds instead of our current, there are about globally 15,000 nuclear weapons. And only at that point, I think, can you look further at further safety measures. So those tracks, I think we have to pursue simultaneously. With North Korea, the human side that's being developed with exchanges and cultural connection that the South Koreans and many other ones are leading has to be done in tandem with this.
Okay. Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, just let me pick up on 2 points. First, if you posit that your adversary is undeterrable, essentially in a rational state, that really feeds into preventive war scenarios. There was talk even in the late 1940s of a preventive war against the Soviet Union. It was a minority view, but there were proponents of preventive war before the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons, which it did in 1949, and the kind of what fed into that was the sense that Stalin was a sociopath. As someone put it, he killed 20 million people just to collectivize agriculture. So it was the character of the Soviet regime, and Kennan played a role in trying to break that down and sort of the character of the Soviet regime and the roots of Russian history. But if you posit the adversary as crazy state, like with Iran a couple of years ago, there was discussion about the Iranian nuclear program and this view that there were some theocrats in Iran who said that the purpose of the Islamic Republic is to kind of usher in the hidden imam, And if you view that, and it's a theological view that some could point to in Iran. The National Intelligence Estimate of 2007 said that Iran operated according to a cost-benefit analysis. But if you view that the state is undeterrable and apocalyptic, that feeds into a preventive war scenario. And likewise, with North Korea, the notion that it's a crazy state. And General McMaster, and his national security advisor, he said that North Korea is undeterrable. Now, if North Korea is undeterrable, then the option for preventive war to prevent them from acquiring capabilities to strike us really gets pushed along. I think that's why I argue that the summit treaties change the psychology of the crisis that way. So I think that's so in a sense we are living kind of with vulnerability and the challenge is like how in that context can we mitigate risks, and that's really my second point, which I won't develop. But the pathways of nuclear risks are kind of accidents of the kind, the guy pushing the wrong button, the sun reflecting off clouds in North Dakota, and a Soviet satellite thinks that they've just launched ICBMs from North Korea. These kinds of technical, accidental things, and then an escalation from a crisis. In the 1980s, there was discussion could a regional conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union through proxies, could it escalate, kind of in the old Sarajevo analogy.
And I would say that we definitely, I mean, based on what we've talked about with the experts saying, we're definitely more vulnerable than is apparent in the policy sector. But I think that what we're most vulnerable to is our lack of awareness, which is our invulnerability, our sense of invulnerability, our false sense of security. And that's probably what is one of the biggest obstacles right now, is the lack of awareness that's been identified in particular by William Perry and Gorbachev and others, but that sense that that this can't happen, that it's reserved, that the domain of this is in the policy sector, that it doesn't belong to us, is something that's quite different from what it was during the 1980s when we came of age during the Cold War, when we had a sense that this issue belonged to all of us, and it transcended party, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, everything, even countries. We came together across borders on this issue. And so I think it's this false sense of security that is making us most vulnerable today, this lack of awareness, and a media that is largely sleepwalking and not fulfilling its ethical responsibility, as they did so well during the 1980s, to inform us pretty much every day, constantly, about the clear and present nuclear danger, because of all the other issues that are in front of us that are very challenging. This one is taking a back seat when it can really make every other one moot in a matter of minutes or in an afternoon. And when you really realize that we can be vaporized, in a matter of hours, we can have, nuclear winter following that, then you begin to see things differently, and you realize that we do have this policy issue. And I would say that just on the other point, quickly, that I think we need to think that both transactionally and transformationally, that transactionally we can make progress that can lead to transformation. But I think we have to keep the vision of transformation, because if we don't have that vision, we're not going to get there. So I think both have to work hand in hand.
Okay, we've got a compact period of time here for questions, so maybe what I'll do is take a couple at a time. We have mics, so if I'll call on you, if you just take a mic, name, affiliation if you have one, and your question.
Yes, thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. Bob, I have a couple questions. Number one, have you talked to a nuclear physicist? My point is, I talked to some, and they said it'll take 10 plus years to completely denuke, not partial, complete. And that's a long time. 10 plus years is a long time. And number two, how far have we developed the missile defense system that we've been working on? So those are the two questions.
Let's take the gentleman right here as well. Thank you.
Alexander Naumov from George Mason University. What is your assessment of the recent speeches by Vladimir Putin? The last one in October, telling Russians that in the event of a nuclear war, we're going to go to heaven, and then the other guys are просто вздохнут, like they're just going to keel over and die. And his what Russian opposition has been calling the cartoons, the all-new wonder weapon systems, how seriously should those be taken? And how does this change the possibility of either Russian diplomats or the American side proposing the measures that you are talking about?
Okay, so, and just to be clear, your question, sir, was about denuclearizing North Korea, or, okay, so duration for denuclearization, ballistic missile defense, and Putin's words. Who wants to start?
I think, you know, I agree with how, you know, Cynthia put it, with it, that, you know, transactional, you know, cumulative transactional steps can lead to transformation. I think we just have to think through what the sequence is, and, you know, developing narratives that allow regimes, you know, the states we're engaged with to kind of develop a positive kind of narrative of what this change would be. With Russia, I mean, it's complicated because Putin sort of sees us as pursuing essentially a regime change strategy towards Russia through democratization, all the stuff Matt's been working on. They, of course, intervened in our election, you know, to affect the outcome there. And what's the size of the Russian economy these days? Like, is it Finland or Italy or one of those? You know, it's you know,
I'm not sure. It's $1 trillion
Portugal
to $2 trillion.
Or Spain and Portugal.
Okay, so you're talking about, you know, China's got a GDP equal to the U.S. size. Probably it's you know, purchasing parity is probably greater. You know, I mean, it's China is a superpower as we think about superpower across various categories, hierarchies of power. Russia is still, it's not necessarily the Cold War. There were books, you know, the one-dimensional superpower, but it is pretty much, you know, it's got that, and Russia's invested in nuclear because it's cheaper than conventional capabilities. There's been that aspect of it as well, but you've got the particular, you know, personality and pathology, frankly, of Putin, and if I were a citizen of the Russian Federation, that, you know, I'm going to heaven, you know, I wouldn't take great solace out of that. But and he had another allusion to, you know, his sort of bring it on moment, where he said, if the Americans want another Cuban Missile Crisis, we're game. I mean, it's really this kind of you know, bravado. I mean, you can't really sit in Washington and criticize it, given kind of what's coming out of Twitter all the time. But it's this type of escalation rhetorically is not helpful, and the administration is not. There's a big question, like, is the New START going to be continued or not? You know. Anyway.
Did you want to say something about BMD, ballistic missile defense?
I mean,
obviously, it was not any comfort to you guys.
It's such a fab program. We spent $300 billion, and we can, you know, hit it, you know, a tenth of the time or something. So I mean, you know.
So although we have the largest ballistic missile range test facility on our tiny island of Kauai, which makes us a target, you know, we've spent, as you mentioned, so much money on weapons, missile defense, and it has not been successful. It's been, you know, the chances of of one of those being intercepted is so small. We were not less than 50-50. So we were not, we didn't feel any kind of promise in that possibility. You want to address that?
No, on that, I mean, you can fill the sky full of drones and other things, and there's serious problems to our little, defending even our little island in Hawaii. So, and I won't go on about that, but you can look at the studies for 50-50 is about the current probability of, you know, it's like they always say, hitting, you know, a bullet with a bullet. But anyway, your comment about Mr. Putin, his comment that they would never be the first to use nuclear weapons. This is a very critical doctrine that the U.S. doesn't have that policy. And we say we will be the first to use nuclear weapons if we need to defend not only ourselves, but also our allies in Europe or in Southeast Asia. And this is a sore point for many anti-nuclear activists, why we can't adopt a nuclear no first use policy. Mr. Putin said that they wouldn't be the first to use it, but you know, if they had to, in response, they would you know, be martyrs and go to heaven, where we would be in hell. He's very colorful in his language, but nonetheless, the Russians have a policy that if the survivability of the state is at stake, they will be the first to use nuclear weapons. So essentially, it's the same. And as we know, how one can falsely fear that the survivability of the state is at risk and be the first to use nuclear weapons. So let's see. Oh, the other point, your point about the fantastic weapons. As I understand it from people who know, we have to take some of them seriously. Many of them have been under research and work since the U.S. pulled out of the ABM treaty, if not earlier. Because if you think about it, if you're worried about overwhelming superiority of the United States and all of our advanced technologies, you got to think of smart ways to strike that can evade an anti-ballistic missile system, even if it works. So the tricky little drone that carries radioactive material and sneaks along the bottom of the ocean and hits San Francisco or New York and spreads radiation for miles on each side and renders the port unusable is something that has had serious work on it, as well as other things like sneaky cruise missiles that are nuclear powered that can go around the tip of South America. And if you, in Putin's March speech, there was a lot of attention given to the one that was appeared to hit Mar-a-Lago, but there was actually one also that was headed to Hawaii, and that was the nuclear-powered cruise missile. So we took note of that. So these are not all simply fantastic ideas that are not potential to actually be deployed and realized.
And they're highly destabilizing, as we mentioned before, and there are no rules of the road for these new technologies, and we're not talking to each other about them. So it makes for a time where we absolutely need to take the steps that we've identified in this nuclear playbook that's really come from so many different experts and former leaders, et cetera, because without some rules of the road, without some dialogue, there's no way out of this mess. We have to talk to each other to get out of the mess. Even if we don't want to talk to each other, we have to if we want to survive. I mean, that's really the bottom line here, that our chances, our luck has been enormous. We've survived mainly through luck, through all these false alarms, through all these issues, through all these near misses. We can't rely on that for the rest of, even the rest of the next 10 years, the next 5 years, even maybe a year. We have to do this. It's essential. It's existential. That's basically our message.
We can take maybe a couple more questions, so we'll go here, and then the gentleman here.
Richard Coleman, retired from CBP. The rationality of mutually assured destruction is, I guess, maybe that's the false security that people are relying on. And in the list of things that need to be changed, to letting the President of the United States unilaterally push the button, a president that we currently have that has denigrated the intelligence that would be, supposedly saying who's rational, who's not rational, and because Putin or Kim is irrational, it's irrational of us not to push the button first. Do you see any prospect that the politics would ever allow that, taking that authority away from the U.S. president?
Okay, and let's go here.
David Burnell, politics, policies, international development over different incarnations in Washington and other continents, and friends of some of the people up here. You began with a quote from, I think it was Perry, about without the leadership of Russia and the U.S., there could be no, let's call it institutionalization worldwide of a framework that would be the moral and legal deterrent that's necessary for everybody. Now, with that in mind, do we need to think about something bold to create what amounts to be, for lack of a better simile, a United Nations institutionalization, but not the United Nations, an alternate framework, an alternate participation with leadership not just from the U.S. and Russia, which is critical, but perhaps with China, India, pick any 2 or 3 others, where it would literally be focused exclusively on reinstitutionalizing a framework and a process globally that had the credible leadership of a handful or more of the powers and an incentive for them to want to become leaders.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Just leave it there. Right there. Okay. So, question about whether the proposal to take away the president's unilateral authority to launch is politically realistic, and whether we should make a new effort at a UN-type global governance institution that's more inclusive or somehow more serious. Any thoughts on that, guys?
Well, I'd like to address the restricting presidential authority point. Most people who are aware of the legislation that's been proposed that we referenced by Lou Markey to restrict presidential authority to relaunch nuclear weapons think that it's maybe come to pass during the Trump administration, but it actually was introduced during the Obama administration. It wasn't targeted at this particular president, and because it just doesn't make sense that that awesome power should be in one person's hands. There should be some kind of restraint involved. Should be some other people involved right now in that process of who gets to press the button. And right now, there is absolutely no one in the official chain of command between the president and the button. There's no one who can restrict the president in current policy. So, and I think that what we are seeing is this legislation taking traction not only in Congress, particularly on the Democratic side, but we're also seeing a growing public movement that's supporting this. And the state of California passed this legislation. Cities are passing it. There's a movement that is really growing. And it's that kind of public support that builds the awareness that what really made the difference in the 1980s, in addition to partnering within the Congress in a bipartisan way, as we talked about, and the president having the wake-up calls. There were many things that came together in the 1980s to really begin to transform our nuclear policy. I think this is one that's inspired a lot of people. I think it may be difficult to achieve, but I think that it is gaining momentum across the country, not just in the Californias, but in churches, in small places in the Midwest. It's really gaining momentum. So I think we have to look to these. It's one of the steps that we've aligned with because it is something that's really growing. So I think it's something that we do need to try to think about because it really is, it's just not the right thing that one person has this awesome power. There has to be some restraint, and it wasn't conceived at the time that we would be in a situation where we might have people who are really irrational in positions of power with that awesome power. So we need to address that.
Just quickly follow up on that. There are even constitutional issues about whether such a measure could be passed, and it's problematic. Certainly, no one on the planet should be able to essentially create such destruction that it would result in the death of billions of people and the end of civilization as we know it. No one should have that authority. So the
whether in Russia or any country.
Of course, we're not in position to pass legislation in Moscow to restrict President Putin on this score. And some people say, how can we restrict one president and not another? But the point is right in finding ways and public support for it. Certainly, I encourage. There are steps like de-alerting that immediately could bring us more security, because right now the greatest risk of catastrophe comes from ICBMs that are on high alert status in the United States and in Russia. And there have been proposals, intelligent proposals, to work in concert with Russia to de-alert initially some portion of ICBMs and work from that point. There are also fairly high alert status in submarine-launched ballistic missiles. But we need to start with steps in that area. That gives decision makers more time. So right now, as we know, the president has 8 or 10 minutes maybe to decide to send the codes, which are no longer than a tweet, and that would result in a launch. So certainly, we have to take, we have to do what we can. With regard to the question about how we might have a multilateral approach, certainly there's potential now to bring the United States, Russia, and China into a dialogue on nuclear stability, nuclear issues. There have been, the Chinese have taken a position that, you two are the 1,000-pound gorillas here and need to bring things down before we really would kind of draw into it. They've held, and it's now somewhat questionable, but they've held at a level of about 300 weapons, and they've had the warheads separated from the missiles, so it would take time actually to actually launch. And so these issues really could, its potential, at least from people who understand these issues more than we do, I think there is potential there. And it's necessary, difficult, but extremely necessary to draw in beyond our traditional bilateral framework.
But most of the other nuclear powers are saying, like China, the U.S. and Russia really have to get your act together and start doing things together. Since you have more than 90% of the nuclear weapons, if you're not going to act, why should we act? Why should we go? I mean, that's sort of the approach. So that's why the leadership statement is there, that it has to happen with all nuclear powers. But we have, the U.S. and Russia, have a responsibility because they have so many nuclear weapons to take a leadership position. So the others can then follow and join, and then we can move forward together.
Well, thank you very much, guys. Rob has agreed, for the sake of ending right on time, to forego his final word. Thank you all for joining us. Please join me in thanking our speakers and our commenter today.